Hello, welcome to Module 3, Lesson 2 of our CASP Plus course. This lesson in Security Engineering and Cryptography covers the following topics such as hardening techniques, processes, mandatory access control, trustworthy computing, and compensating controls. So hardening techniques. It is important to understand that there are numerous ways to improve a device's security posture. So in this specific section, we're going to look into a few different hardening methods as shown here. First is removing unneeded services. Running unnecessary services on the computer systems give malicious actors such as malwares, rats, and worms more opportunities to connect. Based on the system's business requirement, we should disable these services in order to reduce the system's overall security footprint. For instance, running file and print sharing services is not necessary for a public web server that is accessible to the internet, even though it may be necessary if the server is used as an internal server for a department. Disabling unused accounts. It's also important to recognize systems or user accounts that are already installed but could pose a security risk. Guest accounts and support accounts made by vendors are two examples of potential risks. A security policy should be in place to guarantee that this process is automated. On a Windows 10 host computer, we can see which default local accounts have been disabled in this specific figure. An account should be disabled if it is no longer required for use in an information system. Next is images and templates. A customized, hardened operating system image is a good security building block that can help with the objective of putting in place a strong security posture for end devices. The Windows Secure Host baseline build image of the Windows operating system is present on networks used by the U.S. Department of Defense. This makes sure that the deployment is secured by design. There are more than 20 or 200 specific security requirements in this case that must be turned on by default. The GitHub repository as shown here, right, contains all the tools required to build an operating system build image and verify it. Next is removing end-of-life devices. A device should be decommissioned when it is deemed unusable or when it poses an unreasonable risk to the company. Now, when moving a device, it's important to ensure that this doesn't compromise the network security posture. If it's a security device, it needs to be changed. Removing end-of-support devices. A device becomes vulnerable when it can no longer be secured by vendor support and patching. For instance, in January 2020, Microsoft stopped providing support for the Windows 7 operating system. There were 135 vulnerabilities affecting Windows 7 as of July 2021, and that's according to the CVE database, or the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure Database. Vulnerabilities frequently go unpatched because end-of-support devices and operating systems do not offer automated patching. Next is local drive encryption. Managed FDE will offer protection for important business data in the event that mobile devices are lost or stolen. The built-in FDE option for Windows operating system is BitLocker. Next is enabling no execute never bit. It is also important to check that built-in security is turned on to provide defense against this attack vector for any system hosting applications that could be susceptible to attacks against the system memory. While 64-bit Intel CPU support execute never XN, 64-bit AMD CPU support no execute as a security feature. These features are intended to stop code from running in memory spaces designated for data storage. Given the design, it would be challenging for an attacker to use the memory location for the execution of arbitrary commands in order to cause a buffer overflow. As you will see in this figure, it shows how data execution protection, right? Security feature on Windows has this setting activated by default. All Windows services and applications on Windows servers have these settings turned on. Chips with RISC or RISC ARM processor can support the XN bit. You can visit this specific website, right, for more details about this one. Next is disabling the CPU virtualization support. The endpoint device's firmware settings are typically where you can find the setting for virtualization support. Virtual images may be launched in hypervisor if it's enabled. For the vast majority of user desktop, this is not typically necessary. If it's enabled, a user might be able to run unauthorized software on a virtual machine. Next is secured, encrypted enclaves and AMD secure memory encryption. Nowadays, a lot of processors come with built-in support for memory encryption. As a result, both the RAM's data and the CPU memory itself can be protected. Secure memory encryption, or SME, is a feature that AMD CPUs are compatible with. This generates an ephemeral key at boot time and employs AES 128-bit encryption. Most operating systems can run the feature transparently when support is enabled in the system, firmware, or BIOS. This support can be used by software programs to encrypt and decrypt memory pages. Next is shell restrictions. It is common to block access to the shell itself or to restrict the commands that can be accessed within the shell in order to restrict a user's access to command shell tools and utilities. It is standard procedure on Windows operating systems to restrict standard users' access to the command prompt or CMD and PowerShell interfaces. Since most of the functionality of Linux and Unix systems is accessed outside of the graphical user interface, this is not really an option for those systems. Bash and Corn Shell are two frequently used shells on Linux. So here on this figure, right, we have created a new user account with a restricted shell by using the -s switch command. The restricted shell only supports a small set of commands. The user is unable to execute any commands found in other directories or access robust administrator tools. And the last one is address space layout randomization, or ASLR. Right? ASLR. So the ASLR technique is intended to defend computer systems from memory-related attacks. By turning on this feature, it stops an attacker from being able to anticipate where applications will be located using memory addressing. An attacker might, for instance, try to use a buffer overflow attack and then make a call to a memory location where they believe a shell is running. The kind of attack is mitigated by ASLR because it always assigns random memory locations to the running applications. Here on this figure, right, you can see the default setting for a Windows 10 client here, right, for ASLR. The majority of operating systems include Linux, Windows, and Mac OS support this specific feature. Okay. Now let's go to processes. So there are two types, right? Patching and firmware that we have to discuss. And actually, the third one is logging and monitoring, but it's behind this image. But let's focus on patching first. So all of our assets must be identified, right? And we must make sure that automated device patching is enabled. We run the risk of vulnerabilities resulting in data loss or possible availability issues if we can't deploy vendor patches. Now, to prevent the possibility of these disruptions and availability problems, patching should be planned. Before implementing operating system or software application patches in a live environment, it is ideal to thoroughly test their effects in a test staging environment, and it is important to select patch management tools that support diverse environments. You can visit this specific link for more information about the Manage Engine product. Next is firmware. So the embedded operating system code must be updated because if it is not if it is not, it may be open to attacks. For instance, SIP or the Session Initiation Protocol of Cisco iOS has a number of vulnerabilities that could be exploited to cause a denial of service condition. It's a SIP. A cybersecurity flaw described in CVE 2008-3799 allows an attack to result in a memory leak which eventually causes resource depletion. SIP is a calling protocol that is used with VoIP to connect to another subscriber. Due to the widespread adoption of this technology in business-based telephony solution, it is important to protect this important functionality. Next is logging and monitoring endpoint devices. Security professionals can be informed of any anomalous activities involving endpoint devices and any discrepancies in configuration changes, and thanks to the ongoing monitoring of endpoint devices. The Managed Engine MDM platform, as shown in this figure, displays the health status of the endpoint devices it is monitoring, right? So it is important to receive notifications when malware has been installed on a device when security regulations are not followed. Now let's talk about mandatory access control. Our first topic is SE Linux. SE Linux was initially created as a collection of patches for the Linux operating systems that added security modules. It was initially created by the NSA, or the National Security Agency of the United States, but it is now open source. The majority of Linux distributions include it, due to discretionary access control, or DAC, which is used by the majority of operating systems. The owner of a file or folder has the ability to set or modify its permissions. The root account typically has the ability to alter permissions on other user files and folders, but SE Linux enforces MAC. So doing so will not be effective as the system will override these changes. Next is Android Security Enhanced Linux. By integrating SE Linux into the Android mobile operating system, the Android operating system adds security extensions, which is sometimes referred to as SE Android. It uses the same security model as SE Linux and was incorporated into Android version 4.4. There are actually many security controls available, and one of which is preventing unauthorized use of privileged services and daemons. Applications must be run in a sandbox, and a policy extension is available to impose further limitations. Although the kernel provides most of the security, middleware mandatory access control enables the assignment of application privileges both during installation and during runtime. The enforcing mode is the default setting for SE Android. In order to securely store measurements or certificates, many additional security upgrades for SE Android rely on hardware support. Now let's talk about trustworthy computing. So the first one is Trusted Platform Module Technology, or TPM, the TPM module. A specific hardware security module, or HSM, known as the Trusted Platform Module, is built into many system boards. This secure module offers secure measurement or value storage in addition to having the ability to process cryptography. The TPM standard is supported by a large number of hardware and software vendors and it's actually a recognized standard. A TPM is frequently used to guarantee the platform integrity of an operating system. If the recorded values for Microsoft BitLocker are inconsistent at boot time, the boot process will halt, right? So platform configuration registers, or PCRs, are the names given to the values that are stored, and about 6 of these PCRs are typically used to confirm that the platform has not been tampered with. Some of the typical values that can be stored are shown on this specific figure. So a cryptographic hash of these values is kept on file. Other value types that can be stored include software application versions. Now let's talk about secure boot. So here, checking the integrity of the bootloader required to run the installed operating system has become standard practice to ensure the integrity of operating systems. This feature has been supported by Windows operating systems starting with Windows 8.0. It is necessary for this to have a supported firmware interface that has a preloaded security key. The boot files are validated during the boot process after being signed with the preloaded key. Secure boot is turned on by default in computers that come pre-installed with Windows 10. This figure shows the components required for a secure boot. To add support for Linux Secure Boot, we would need to ensure there is a signed Linux bootloader. To do this, we could add the operating system's vendor public key into the UEFI. And then let's talk about what UEFI is. So since 2008 release of Windows 8.0, UEFI has been accepted firmware to support pizza systems. In comparison to the BIOS, right, or the basic input-output system, it has a number of benefits such as a mouse-driven graphical environment. System evaluations and security processing can be done before the operating system is launched thanks to UEFI. When operating systems are installed on SSDs or solid-state drives, they launch quickly, making it challenging to press the right function key quickly enough to access the menu. The Windows Advanced Recovery Options menu in the operating system is a common way to access the UEFI settings. The Windows menu used to access the UEFI settings is displayed on this figure. Next is BIOS protection. So since the 80s, right, the BIOS component has been a requirement for computer systems. It permits the CMOS, or the complementary metal oxide semiconductor, which requires a power source or battery to retain settings to be configured and to perform a series of power-on self-tests or posts. Apart from allowing for password protection of the BIOS setting, it doesn't offer much in the way of security. Next is attestation services. Secure values can be transmitted from a hardware device to an attestation service using attestation services. Within the Azure Cloud Services, Microsoft offers a service known as Host Attestation Service. The host DPM can be used to store values that cannot be altered after a device has been registered. Making sure that debugging tools are not being used by host operating systems as part of the host operating system is one example of how to use this service. This is due to the possibility that debugging tools could give hackers access to the local system's memory and consequently to private information. Next is HSM, or hardware security modules. So an independent hardware device that supports crypto processing capabilities and the safe storage of encryption keys is known as HSM, or the hardware security module. When hosting applications that require access to priceless private keys, this can be a useful security requirement. Websites for banks and e-commerce will typically need to use HSMs. The majority of implementations allow for the safe storage of server keys inside the data center and are rack-mounted applications. Next is measured boot. So PCR results from the TPM can be verified with measured boot, right? Cryptographic hashes of the values themselves are kept on file. A number of values can be combined into a single hash value because the hashes are organized into a blockchain. As you will see, this figure shows the hash chaining function. So when unlocking BitLocker encrypted hard drives, hash chain measurements can be used both locally and forwarded to server-based attestation services. Next is self-encrypting drives. Performance may also be a goal when thinking about using FDE, or full device encryption. Self-encrypting drives use integrated hardware to provide encryption outperforming software encryption in terms of performance. So included in portable computing devices, this is going to be very helpful. All right, now let's talk about compensating controls. So for Windows operating system, antivirus software should be implemented as a centrally managed solution. Malware primarily targets Windows. Instances of infections on Unix and Linux systems are extremely rare. Linux email and file servers, however, run the risk of spreading infected files to Windows users. Using signature definition files, conventional antivirus software detects malware. However, a virus might be designed to change its signature, making the signature definition strategy useless. Therefore, more recent antivirus programs can search a suspicious file for common strings. Microsoft Windows Defender is a built-in security feature of Windows, but there are also additional malware protection application suites available to supplement this. Next is a HIDS or HIPS, or host-based intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system. So here it's critical when the defense in depth can be useful when implementing security for your end devices. Any network-based protection measures put in place will be complemented by HIDS or HIPS. Host systems will generally block any malicious actions and assist in stopping any attempts to replace system files, as well as anomalous administrator actions. A HIDS or HIPS will cooperate with additional anti-malware tools. Next is host-based firewalls. So by preventing unauthorized connections on an internal network segment, all known east-west traffic, a local firewall will support network firewalls. Host-based firewalls are frequently installed on the most widely used operating systems to accomplish this. Windows Defender Firewall is a feature of Microsoft Windows that can be controlled visually or through PowerShell commands. And as you will see here, right, this figure shows a screenshot of the Windows Firewall. All right, now let's talk about EDRs, or Endpoint Detection Response Software. So EDR software enables the installation of an agent on endpoint gadgets. Although it does not rely on definition files or known malware hashes, it will coexist with conventional anti-malware solutions. Endpoint monitoring should be continuous, with logs being sent to the EDR provider in order to be best prepared for potential threats. With databases of APT actors or advanced persistent threat actors, TPPs, and gathered baseline data from typical activity, actions can be processed in real time, enabling the detection of IOCs or the indicators of compromise. For businesses without spare SOC personnel, many security providers often offered as a managed security service, or MSSPs, and offer fully managed solutions. EDR software will better safeguard businesses from ransomware, fileless malware, and zero-day exploit as the new attacks are launched on a regular basis. Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and CrowdStrike are popular alternatives for these. Next is through the use of redundant hardware. So we must find ways to make important systems more resilient when hosting them, because their failure could have a disproportionately negative effect. Reliable network interface cards, storage, and power supplies are frequently used on servers in data centers. In these circumstances, it is crucial to pinpoint the areas where single points of failure can adversely affect the workload. Next topic is self-healing hardware. So we should put in place systems that can recognize problematic events and, where necessary, make adjustments wherever it is possible to increase resilience. Using hardware clusters as an illustration, a workload might be hosted on another node if a heartbeat signal is not sent in time. In today's hard drives, bad blocks are automatically marked out and replaced with reserved blocks kept in a server pool or reserve pool. The Resilient File System, or REFS, is a feature that is available on Microsoft operating system as of Windows Server 2012 and allows for this. The hosted drives are constantly scanned by an integrity scanner that the REFS deploys, and if necessary, it starts a repair process. And the last one is the User and Entity Behavior Analytics, or UEBA. It is becoming more and more common to use analytics to identify patterns of behavior in order to protect valuable company data. When a user account is suddenly used inappropriately, the system has the option of notifying administrators or stopping the behavior. Imagine that on December 25, a user named Joe, who is based in the UK, logs into his work email from a place that is known to be in North Korea. He then starts deleting significant amounts of crucial manufacturing data from the engineering team shared drive. If had been in use, this would have immediately alerted his line manager and the SOC team, right, or the Security Operations Center team. Okay, that's the end of the lesson. Here we spoke about hardening techniques, processes, mandatory access control, trustworthy computing, and compensating protocols, or compensating controls, rather. All right, again, thank you very much for watching the video.